Здравствуйте, товарищ, or welcome, friends. So this is an overview, an example of play for Neu-Schwerpunkt version 1 rules. The main point, sorry for the German-English pun, is Neu-Schwerpunkt is based on the SPI Modern Battle series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video uses a figure game version of these rules, which you can download if you wish from the Neu-Schwerpunkt.io group site. This is not going to be a rules-focused video. Instead, it will provide an overview of what a game using these rules should look like or feel like. Originally, my examples videos were designed to provide a guide of how to play a set of rules. But these days, its only objective is to give gamers an idea of the play of a set of rules. This can help players determine if it's something they are interested in or not. This set of rules, while using figures, is based on a board game and is designed to duplicate a reasonably large-scale military conflict, in this case German corps and Russian army size. With each division, or Russian corps, representing about 12 elements, a German corps or Russian tank army would require each player to deploy between 36 and 48 elements each, which gives you a reasonable 4 to 6 hour game. Now, just a point, this is not a normal figure gaming scale. Most figure gaming would typically have a brigade on each side at the most. So you will notice or get the impression that there's a lot of things happening here which is not what you would typically expect in a standard figure gaming game. I'm not going to be making any attempt to describe the actual SPI board gaming. The only significant point about it is its scale. Each unit, for the most part, represents a battalion, with the width of each unit being about 1800 metres. Each game turn represents a day, that is 12 hours for modern and 24 hours for World War II. And World War II is the scale which we'll be using in this example. This example, as a result, takes place over 8 days. In my example, I'll be using a scenario from the Würzburg game, but the period is supposed to be June 1944 and involves a Soviet attack against a German-held city somewhere in Russia. I must admit the playing area is covered in a more developed and forested area or terrain than a typical area in Russia, but this was done because I've created a custom playing area covering this scenario and it looks rather nicer than my generic playing areas. You can probably play the scenario with any type of playing area as long as you have a river running across the playing area and there's a nice big city somewhere on the river and in the centre flank. Now, this scenario is based on a board gaming scenario, which for figure gamers figure games is normally less than ideal. In this scenario, reinforcements are fed into the battle in a carefully managed manner to allow each player to defend or push forward in a very specific manner. It's very finely balanced and is only really viable in a board game environment using hexes. Figure gaming tends to be far more variable and flexible, thus it's impossible to create a similar scenario and expect similar results. A slight difference in terrain placement could throw the entire game out. This test game was an attempt to see if I was wrong in this assumption. Because the playing area was specifically designed for this scenario, it did actually play out in a very similar manner to the board game. However, on a more generic playing area, I'm certain it would not quite work out as well. I'll need to test this more, but I suspect the optimal scenario for a figure game is one which is not so finely tuned, reinforcements arriving at a lesser frequency and with victory conditions being far more generic and taking into account a lot more objectives on the playing area. Let's now start with game turn 1. The Germans initially deploy an infantry division, with the Russians receiving a tank corps on game turn 1. I later discovered on game turn 8 I neglected to deploy the anti-tank battalion. The lesson to be learned here is to arrange your reinforcements in a manner which helps you avoid this type of error, as this was a reasonably important error. This shows the critical centre location after the first Russian movement phase. The Russians enter on one of two roads which lead into their player edge. The Germans are holding the main town, which in this case is Würzburg, shown in the red circle. The infantry battalions are all fortified, which give them a major defensive bonus. The Germans have decided to only defend the town behind the river. As the Germans only consist of one infantry division, it was not able to defend the entire front line. A lot of this is dependent also on the victory conditions, which in this case is centred on the Germans controlling any part of Würzburg and ensuring the road leading south is clear. The Germans thus decide to only hold 3 element-size areas of Würzburg. The Soviets are attacking with a tank corps, with the tank battalions all allocated against the Germans in the town, and the motorised infantry conducting a wide outflanking manoeuvre. In retrospect, I'm uncertain how historical this is. Perhaps the rules need some tweaking. The Soviets are going to launch 3 attacks with the purpose of dislodging the German infantry. The attack was a low-risk test attack to give my opponent some familiarity with the combat rules. While there is a very small chance of dislodging perhaps one German unit, there is also the risk of losing tank units if this is successful. Starting from the left of the Russian position, 2 tank battalions have a combined strength of H. Each tank unit has 4 attacking strength points. The German infantry battalion has a defensive strength of 2, and there is 1 FPF or fire protection fire or point factor coming from the supporting artillery. The difference becomes +5. There is a total of 6 shifts, 4 for the fortification and 2 for other terrain, resulting in a -4-3 differential. The result is A1, with the Russian retreating 1 base width. This shows you how useful artillery can actually be. Moving to the centre, the attack is the same, and the Russians receive the same result, which is retreat 1 base width. At this differential, the only possible result is a A1, or attack a retreat 1. The final attack on the Russian right flank is the same. The Russians retreat 1 base width. The German fortification bonus is very powerful, and the main objective of the Russians in the early part of the game is to force the Germans to lose this bonus by making the units retreat, which is why these attacks tend to be so important. This shows the final position in the important position or location of Würzburg. The attacker was conducting these attacks to provide an example of combat. Now, it is possible that the Germans may have tried to allocate more FPF against one attack in the hope of trying to force an AE, and thus there would be less elsewhere, which could result in the German units retreating. However, it's very unlikely the Germans would take this risk for the small opportunity of trying to destroy 2 tank units, although if that happened that would be great, because the consequences would be more significant. This shows the top-down view. On the left, the Russians are sending their motorised infantry, on the left flank of the Soviet or Russian position, the Russians are sending their motorised infantry to outflank the Germans. This is a critical tactical move. Now, this is based off the Siege of Würzburg scenario, and most players don't attempt to do this. I tend to do it. Most players just try and bash away at Würzburg until they actually dislodge the defending forces, and basically the victory conditions give them a victory in this case. However, the outflanking manoeuvre gives you the additional opportunity of cutting off the road, which also gives you a victory, although it's a high-risk operation. As we'll see in this game, not so high risk because of some errors I made with reinforcements. The Germans adjust their front line in an attempt to shore up their position, and that's the end of game turn 1. We now move into a game turn 2. As you can see here, the Germans receive some reinforcements, a core level artillery asset and the advance column of a Panzer Grenadier division. For game turn 2, the Russians launch a more serious attack against Würzburg, this time with artillery support. Meanwhile, on the Russian left flank, which is the right of the screen here, the outflanking manoeuvre continues. As you can see here, the Russians have deployed their 76mm field artillery battalion and rocket artillery battalion to support the attack. Now, in the first attack, the Germans use 1 FPF, which is provided by the 10.5cm howitzer battalion. The The Russians decide not to use their artillery support in the first attack, and the result is an A1, which is similar to game turn 1. The Russians retreat. Incidentally, just to clarify, the Russians allocate their barrage before the FBF occurs, so the Russians basically decide not to allocate any artillery barrage support even before the Germans decide to allocate the 1 FPF. However, the Germans should allocate the 1 FPF there, because then it means there is no chance of a both retreat, which would be a bad result. Moving to the centre, the result is the same. The Russians basically decide not to allocate any barrage, but the Germans still allocate a FPF, in this case from the 15cm artillery battalion. Now we come to the last attack. In this case, the Russians decide to use all their artillery, which totals 3. The rocket battery provides 3 barrage points, and the 76mm field artillery battery 1 barrage points, totaling 4. The attack has a total strength of 12, with the defenders at a strength of 3 because there is 1 FPF. The differential is +9. After 6 shifts, the result is -1, and the Russians spin a 2, resulting in a BR, or both retreat result. The German infantry retreats and now loses its fortification bonus. This is a rather unlucky occurrence. Now you may ask, why wouldn't the Germans throw all their FPF against this to try and avoid it? The simple answer to that is, if they did that, there is a very small chance of a BR for the other 2 attacks, and you don't actually reduce your chance of a BR very much in the last attack. So this is probably the best German strategy. At the end of game turn 2's Russian combat phase, this is the position. Now, the effect of the river is rather subtle, but the Russians have actually achieved their objective. The Germans will move back into the Würzburg location, but will only have a standard terrain shift of 2 without the bonus shift of 4. They've basically lost their fortification bonus. Now you may ask, why didn't the Russian advance after combat? And this is where the river comes in. If it advanced after combat and the Germans managed to counterattack and caused it to retreat, you cannot retreat across the river. You are eliminated. So rather than risk losing a tank battalion at this early stage of the game, the Russians have decided not to advance after combat and are happy with basically dislodging the German position. Now, personally, I feel the fortification bonus is too strong and was clearly made so strong to resolve a play balance issue. Again, another modification if you wish to use fortification. I must note that I can't actually remember the rules. Normally in the Modern Battles quad, you only get the best modification. However, the fortification, so as a result, if there's a river and a built-up area, each give you a shift of 2. You only get 1 shift of 2. You don't get them added together. Now, the fortification is a special rule in the scenario, and it's unclear if this is added or if it's basically the best bonus you get, and so it should only be 4 shift. I remember when I played this game in board game competitions many years ago, this was certainly an area of confusion because the rules are a little bit uncertain. I suspect there was a errata sheet, or someone must have asked SPI to provide the actual position, and I can't for the hell of me remember what that reply would have been. So I'm simply assuming the fortification is a special bonus on top of normal terrain. This shows the top-down view after the German movement phase. You can see the Germans have cobbled together a defensive line against the outflanking move, and the infantry has moved back into Würzburg. The red line shows the German movement zone of control, which the Russians cannot pass except by combating the German forces and pushing them back. We now move into game turn 3. At this point I have made a major error. I forgot to deploy the 6th motorised infantry battalions of the Panzer Grenadier Division, and this would have made a massive difference for the remainder of the game. I wondered why I was having so much problems as the Germans and why I lost so decisively. A complex reinforcement schedule does make this more likely, but I must admit it was a stupid error on my part regardless, and one which I would probably never make again if I ever decide to repeat this scenario. The artillery, which was from the Panzer Division, was actually deployed, so I didn't forget everything. I just forgot the most important component. My opponent made sure he deployed his 6 tank battalions and 6 motorised infantry battalions, so he was clearly smarter than I was. This shows the position after the Russian movement phase. As you can see, the Germans were holding the Russian infantry back just, but you'll notice a column of Russian tanks on the right. This was going to be a bigger problem to hold back. If I had my 6 motorised infantry battalions, I would have had a chance, but as it turned out, I was not going to be able to hold the road. Meanwhile, back at Würzburg, the Russians were attacking again. The first 2 attack progress as normal, and the Russians suffer an A1 as they normally do. The final attack is the main attack, with the Russian attack strength being 12 against 3, with only 2 shifts this time instead of 6. The infantry has lost its fortification special bonus. The final result is a D1, which means the German infantry retreats 1 base width. Now you may ask, what's the difference between this and the previous result? Well, the difference is the Russian tanks remain where they are, which means if the Germans wanted to move back in to Würzburg, they would have to attack the tanks. And quite frankly, at this early stage of the game, they lack the capacity to do so. Now, if they did, and they forced the tank back, that would be great, but it's a low probability attack. The Germans simply lack the forces, and they need everything they can to try and stem the Russian armour coming in off their flank. Now, once again, the Russians do decide not to advance after combat. This is because you cannot retreat over a river, and if it's crossed and was forced back, the tank battalion would be destroyed. So while it's a low probability chance of the Germans counterattacking and destroying the tanks, it's still a chance, and the Russians decide not to take it. However, as I indicated before, the objective has been met. The Germans have lost that part of their side of Würzburg. They can't move back in unless they want to attack, and it's probably unlikely that they would be able to succeed in that attack. The Russians only need to dislodge the final infantry battalion in Würzburg, and they have a real shot at taking the entire city. Now we move to game turn 4, with the Russians getting the remainder of their 2nd Tank Corps. The Germans get ground support points, which is a critical advantage, but without those 6 motorised infantry battalion was simply not going to be sufficient to save the day on the flank. This shows the position at the end of the Russian movement phase. The Russians are trying to dislodge the German reconnaissance battalion with a motorised infantry on the left, but they don't have any artillery, which will mean it's not going to be very easy. Back in Würzburg, the main attack continues, but now the Russians are attempting to outflank the Germans on the other flank of Würzburg. It's getting rather grim for the poor old Germans. In this case, the Russians are conducting only 2 attacks. The first involves only 1 Russian tank battalion with artillery support, and it results in an A1. That's at the top of the screen, and it's not shown. The main attack will be conducted in the centre, which is shown. The Russians have 3 tank battalions and the artillery, which totals 16, against the infantry's 2 plus 2 FPF. The Germans allocate 1 additional ground support point, so the differential drops to plus 11. The Russians achieve an A1, and the Russians have to retreat. So the air support was rather critical in this particular case. The Germans have only just managed to hold their corner of Würzburg thanks to ground support points. Now let's swing over to the Russian attempt to outflank Würzburg and cut the road. Because this is fairly critical, the Germans throw all their remaining ground support against the attack, and the remaining ground support is 5. The Soviets attack with 4 SPs against 7, resulting in a -3 differential. There is a 2 shift, and the Russians manage to avoid just an AE result, which would have been a disaster for them. Instead, they retreat because they've achieved an A1 result. This shows the position at the end of the German movement phase, or entire game turn for that matter. The German line is only just holding, but I was forced to throw an artillery battalion into the front line, which is something I never thought I would ever do. Basically, I was really missing my 6 motorised infantry battalions. We now move to game turn 5, and the Germans get more ground support points, 10 in this case, and some core assets. This shows the front line at the end of the Russian movement phase. The Russians are attacking along the entire front line. We will start at the Würzburg area. The Russians take a major risk in their first attack because there are so many critical attacks. The Russians are hoping the Germans do not use their ground support and FPF against this attack. And for the most part, they are correct. It's 4 attacking versus 3 with 6 shifts, with a 5 or 6 resulting in an AE. Luckily, the Russians spin a 4 and just retreat instead of being eliminated. But even if they were AE'd, the only losses would have been a single tank battalion. Painful, but not a critical disaster. Now for the big attack. The Russians throw 16 against 4 with a differential of plus 12. This time no ground support is added, and the result is a BR, both retreat. The Russians have achieved their objective. The reason why there was no ground support is because the Germans needed all at the other end of the front line. This shows the front line at the end of the combat phase. The Russians have now caused the German infantry to lose its fortified status, and the Germans are no longer in Würzburg. Now the Russians aren't in there at the present moment either, but the Germans aren't there and they've lost their fortified bonus. So the Germans will be able to move back in again, but it'll be much easier to permanently dislodge them next game turn. We will now move to a sideshow attack. As you can see, I was forced to insert an artillery battalion in the front line. So the Russians immediately moved into its movement zone of control, so it could not use barrage or FPF. The Russians attack with 2 strength points against 1 strength point and with 2 shifts. The result is an AI, so the Russians retreat, but the Russians have achieved their objective, and the artillery was not able to conduct any FPF or barrage attacks. Now, why was this important? It was important because if it was available to throw FPF, it could have used it in supporting the defence in Würzburg. And as we saw, the retreat of the German infantry was a critical debacle for the poor old Germans. Let's move along the front line and go to the outflanking attack, which you can see now is being conducted by a very large armoured force, which is the second tank corps the Russians received. We'll go to the first attack. In this case, the Russians attack with 12 SPs. Each tank has 4 against 4 SPs. The German tank destroyer has a defence of 2 normally, but when attacked by armour, it goes up to 4. The Germans allocate 2 ground support and 1 FPF, giving it a defence of 7 with 2 shifts. The result is D1. The German retreats and the Russian advances after combat. The road is now cut. The Russians now launch their second attack with 3 tank units. The Germans allocate 2 ground support points and the Russians achieve a D1. The Germans retreat and the Russians advance after combat. Another break in the road, which is fairly important for the victory conditions. But what's more important here is that you can see to the left there is a German reconnaissance unit, and the Russian advance mean that it's truly surrounded. Now, it was already surrounded because there are Russian units to its rear and front, which means its opposing edges have enemy units in contact with it, which means it can't retreat from that position. But the Russian advance that just occurred even makes that position worse. Now we come to the final attack, which is probably the most important in some ways, because the German unit is surrounded, and here is an opportunity for the Russians to eliminate this unit. The Germans allocate their entire remaining 6 ground support points. The Russians attack with 4 against 8 with 2 shifts. The result is an A1 and the Russians retreat. The brave reconnaissance battalion in their town have managed to fight off the nasty Soviets. This is a position at the end of game turn 5. The Russian reconnaissance battalion right now is very exposed. The red line represents the German movement zone controls, and the Russian reconnaissance battalion, while not directly surrounded, is in a position where it could very easily be surrounded and eliminated. We now move to game turn 6 and the Russians start getting their final formation, a mechanized corps. This is the position at the end of the Russian movement phase. Let's start with the second outflanking manoeuvre right at the top of the screen here. I was forced to put a second artillery battalion in the front line here, and in this case it's being attacked by 3 motorised infantry battalions. I actually made an error which I didn't notice, and one of those infantry battalions is within the combat zone of control of that German unit which is circled in red, and thus it should have been attacked. And that attack would have, not been good for that poor old Russian motorised battalion. What should have occurred here was the Russians should have attacked with just 2 of them, so there was no unit that had a combat zone of control within range of that infantry unit. And the result would have been much the same, which in this case was an A1. Well, we're over with that diversion, and now let's move to the critical Würzburg front. Incidentally, the reason why it was important to attack that is that I could have actually brought that artillery down to Würzburg and provided more FPF capacity. In this case, I simply could not do so. Again, I'm missing my 6 motorised infantry battalions. The Russians launch yet again another high-risk attack at the top, which results in a A1. There was a 1 in 3 chance of an AE, but the attack was required as it allowed the following attack to be executed in the manner it was. The Russians focused 20 SPs against 3 with 2 shifts. The result is a D2. The Russians retreat and the Germans retreat and the Russians remain. The Russians pretty much have cleared the town. If the Germans wanted to attempt to reoccupy Würzburg, they would actually have to go in there and attack a lot of Russian units. They simply lack that capability. Or alternatively, if they had all their air power and all their artillery available, they may have been able to just pull it off, but that certainly wasn't the case. Now, as before, while the Russians have actually cleared Würzburg, they're not going to occupy it because if they move 1 unit in, because that's all they can move in advance after combat, the Germans could very well allocate ground support points and barrage points and force it back, which would have meant it was eliminated. Regardless, the Russians actually have achieved the objective they wanted to achieve. They will win the game on another part of the front line. Now we move to the supporting outflanking attack. Once again, a valuable artillery battalion has to attempt to hold back the Russians, and its FPF and barrage is not available for my use. The Russians attack with 4 SPs against the German defence of 3, which has also 2 shifts. The result is a D1. The Germans retreat and the Russians advance after combat. In the next attack of this outflanking manoeuvre, the Russians have 4 SPs versus 2 SPs, and there is 2 shifts. The result is a BR, and both forces retreat 1 base width. This shows the final front line in that part of the sector. To say this is weak is an understatement. Now let's look at the main outflanking attack. In the first attack, the Russians attack with 8 against 4, with no modifiers. The result is a D2. The Germans retreat 2 and the Russians advance after combat. Incidentally, the Russians could advance 2 base widths after combat and remain in the movement zone of control of the German tank destroyer. But they decide against it because if they did that, then the 1 tank unit that would be allowed to do it would be rather exposed. Looking at the next attack in this sector, the Russians attack with 8 against 2, no shifts, and the result is a D2. The Germans retreat and the Russians advance after combat. Once again, they only advance 1 base width because they don't want to be that exposed. As you can see here, when you're defending out in the open against 2-to-1 odds, there ain't much chance. Once again, our brave and surrounded reconnaissance battalion is attacked, this time with the entire ground support being allocated to its defence. The Russians attack with 7 SPs against 12 with 2 shifts. A spin of 5 or 6 would see all the attackers eliminated, but luckily for the Russians, they get an A1 and retreat instead. You can really see the power of ground support points and how much flexibility it provides you. This shows the position after the German movement and combat phase, with the front line beginning to form. The Germans actually surrounded and attacked the Russian reconnaissance unit, and it was unable to retreat and was eliminated. Unfortunately, I didn't photograph that. I'm not quite sure why I didn't. Now we come to game turn 7, which is the second last game turn. The Germans received their Panzer division, and the Russians getting the rest of their mechanised corps. I discovered my error with the motorised infantry at this point and added them as well, but with only 2 more game turns this was not going to help me very much. But it did make me feel slightly better as I realised why I was doing so badly. This is the front line after the German movement phase. The Russians have occupied Würzburg during this game turn and are attacking the German infantry just outside of Würzburg. If they lose, they'll be eliminated, but the Germans have bigger issues elsewhere. In retrospect, I should have ignored the other front and thrown all the ground supports here, hoping to eliminate the German tanks. On the other hand, with the roads cut, it probably didn't make much difference. Let's start with the German left flank, as you can see at the top there. Once again, I made an error with the attack. It should have only been conducted with 2 units rather than the third. Regardless, in either case, it would have resulted in A1 and ensures the Germans can't use this unit's FPF capability and also barrage capacity. This shows the position after the retreat. As you can see, there is a lot of armour coming up as well. One interesting point came up here is that what happens if you're retreating off the playing area? I wonder if you should be eliminated or if you should not be eliminated but not available for the rest of the game. Something to think about. Let's now move to the central front, which is the Würzburg sector, and see if the Russians can force back the German infantry. If they get an A1, it will be very bad for them. The Russians attacked or launched 2 attacks with artillery support. The first is a +6 with 2 shifts and they get a D1. The second is the same. Even with German FPF, they simply lacked sufficient to make a big difference. I should have thrown all the ground support into one of these attacks in order to force the Russians back and be eliminated. Possibly an error, but quite frankly I probably needed those ground support points elsewhere. On the side of Würzburg, coming in off the flank attack, the Russians attack with 12 against 2 and the Germans allocate 5 ground support points here with a 2 shift. The result is A1, so the Russians are forced back. This shows the position on this flank after the Russians have retreated 1 base width. While, it's nice to see the Russians being forced to retreat, I probably would have enjoyed it more if the Russians were eliminated, being forced to cross over the river. Incidentally, in the attack from Würzburg, the Russians advanced 2 base widths in because they inflicted a D2. This is just so they have a little bit of real estate behind them and there's nothing around them, so they can possibly get away with this in this case. Regardless, the Germans are really occupied elsewhere at the present moment and lack the forces to effectively counterattack. Now let's swing down to the major outflanking attack, which was designed to cut off the road. In the first attack, again against one of my poor old artillery battalions, the Russians attack with 3 against 1. There are 2 FPF with a shift of 2. The result is A1. The Russians retreat. They are very effective artillery batteries. This was only really designed to pin down the German artillery so it couldn't use its FPF, and in that it succeeded. In the next attack we have a more serious attack, which is 8 SPs versus 2 SPs. There are no shifts, the result is D2. The Germans retreat 2 base widths. As you can see here, the Russians advance after combat only 1 base width, not 2 base widths. For the next attack in the forest, the Russians attack with 8 SPs versus 4 SPs and there are 2 shifts. The result is D1. The Germans retreat and the Russians advance after combat. For the next attack in the woods, the Russians attack with 8 SP versus 2. There is a shift of 2. The result is D1. The Germans retreat and the Russians advance after combat. This shows the front line in the woods. The Russian tanks have probably moved too far in this, they have moved too far. They should only be 1.5 centimetres from the German tank destroyer units. But, one thing about the game is that it was a comparatively friendly game and we weren't that exact. And anyway, it probably doesn't really make that much difference. But it is an error. Now we get a top-down view of the entire battlefield, showing us the big picture. Würzburg has been lost, the road is cut, and the Russians have achieved a victory as long as they can hold out for 2 more German player turns, which is probably not going to be very difficult to do. Now we come to the German Panzer counterattack, which is actually quite powerful, but it's simply too far from Würzburg to make a real difference. The Germans launch a powerful supporting attack with the reconnaissance battalion, 7 against 2. They throw in 4 ground support and the Russians retreat to D1. The armoured car following. The Russian tank battalion to its front is surrounded. The surrounded unit is attacked with 13 SP. It's forced to retreat and is eliminated, the Germans advancing after combat. The other 2 attacks on the flanks are supported with the remaining artillery and force the Russians back. Up in Würzburg, the Germans actually have a reasonable amount of barrage and FPF capacity, but very little armour. While they could force back the Russian tank battalion into Würzburg and cause the Russians some difficulty in game turn 8, the road is cut, and without the road being open, the Russians basically have won regardless. If I had those critical 6 motorised infantry battalions, I could have held most of the road open, so the Panzer division would be thrusting up into Würzburg instead of trying to open the road. We now start game turn 8, or the 8th day. The Germans have no reinforcements and Der Führer is extremely displeased. Well, that pretty much ended the game. Russians won decisively, and I suspect due to the lack of those critical motorised battalions. Incidentally, we did make a minor error with the Russian reinforcements. They only received 1 T-34-85 battalions, which are their most powerful armoured units, rather than 3. But as it turned out, that probably wasn't historically such a big issue, because when I created the Russian force mix conversion, I did a very simple one, with each real battalion representing a battalion strength unit. In reality, the Russian battalions consisted of only 2 companies of 10 tanks each, or perhaps at a stretch 3 companies of 10 tanks each. This is a very small battalion, about half the size of a German battalion. A better conversion would be to deploy Russian tank brigades of 4 210s, which means that instead of having 3 battalions which are 4 210s, there would only be 1 brigade of 4 210, or maybe a more powerful unit, because we're dealing with a minimum of 60 tanks, which is a good size, or if it's a slightly early tank corps, 90 tanks, which is a very big battalion size unit, so maybe a larger. However, the scenario was designed to emulate the modern battle scenario, so it doesn't really affect the gameplay, only if you want historically accurate formations. The other point is the Russians probably would have been better off having army-level artillery attached, so maybe it would have been better if they had less tank units. And in order to match up with the Würzburg scenario, I would probably add more core supporting units, probably assault guns and artillery. And that actually would have been extremely useful in trying to push the Germans out of Würzburg. On the other side is German air power. Each ground support represents from about 6 to 12 aircraft conducting numerous sorties, which means that this represents, between 60 and 120 ground support aircraft. In June 1944, in Russia, this was possible, but probably not very likely. The lack of Russian ground support is explained by the Russians being at the end of their advance. Thus, out of range of their short-range ground support aircraft, the Germans would be close to their air bases, so their positive effect would be greatly magnified. Look, this is possible, but is probably pushing credibility a bit. The values are based on the modern battle scenario, so I would expect a more realistic value would be probably half this for the Germans. And actually, at the end of a Russian advance, it's probably quite reasonable. You think about it, if the German aircraft are 100 kilometres away from the front line and they're launching multiple sorties over a full day, they could probably get 6 to probably more than 6 sorties in each day per aircraft. If you were at the end of the Russian position, which would be, possibly closer to about 300 kilometres away, you'd be lucky to get 1 or 2 sorties in. So it's quite reasonable to give the defenders at the end of the attackers' advance reasonable air support. It's only on the Western Front where the Americans had so many aircraft that it just didn't really matter where the Americans were driving. They always managed to keep the skies clear. That was certainly not the case in Russia. The other interesting abnormal aspect is the map I used is of Würzburg, which is an area with a lot of infrastructure which may not be reasonable for June 1944 Russia. Down south, the terrain was rougher, but there would be not as many towns and villages. Nonetheless, as I indicated before, the reason why I used this particular playing area is because it's custom made and actually looks a lot better than my generic terrain. I had serious misgivings about the complex reinforcement schedule of the board game, but I must admit it did work. The issue is someone will need to carefully work out the reinforcement schedule of each scenario and document. If that material exists, I think this is probably a good strategy, but if it's lacking, such a complex reinforcement schedule is not possible in an ad hoc game. I realised before I actually had this game, I needed to work on my army lists, and this is an example of a more accurate army list. The result has been an increase in different unit types, which is a downside. However, players could still use these rules with a very simple unit structure. 1-2 for all infantry, 4-2 for all tanks, and 1-1 and 2-1 for artillery units. Movement depends on whether it's foot, horse, or mounted, or truck-towed, etc. There is no need for assault guns, anti-tank guns, reconnaissance units, etc. These have been included in my army list simply to provide a reasonably accurate or reasonably historically accurate divisional or corps structure. So there is a little bit more flavour in each game. You don't need that flavour if you don't want. If you want real simplicity, just go for those basic 4 different unit types and then just basically use a point system, and there you've got your game. During the game, I basically concluded that flanks made little sense at this scale. The flank idea came from Napoleonic rules, or my Napoleonic rules conversion, where flanks and rears were actually important. But at this scale, I went back to the original board game and removed any concept of facing. It works a lot better and it's much quicker and easier to play. One issue I did have during the game was surrounded units, and I had to clean up the rules associated with how to surround a unit a lot more. Once again, the source rules I originally used were my Napoleonic conversion, and I didn't really have many issues there because of the multi-element units. However, I don't have multi-element units here. Each element is a unit. As a result, with the clarifications I put in, it's slightly harder to surround, but it's much clearer when a unit is surrounded and not surrounded. It dramatically reduces ambiguous and uncertain situations on the playing area, which I think actually is one of the main issues with converting a board game to a figure game sort of rules. Once you take the hexes away, you do dramatically increase the ambiguous nature of the rules, and anything that you can do to make things clearer and simpler is probably a good thing. The final observation I made was simply the number of units. I think there were probably too many, in my opinion. Now, this could be because the Germans were confined to a corner of the playing area, probably only around about at the most 1/3 of the entire playing area. But it's something that I need to watch out when I do some additional gaming with different scenarios. I also suspect allowing players to combine artillery battalions into possibly artillery regiments may be a good idea, although it would reduce flexibility. This may be a good optional rule. Anyway, something that I probably need to look very carefully in the future. But I can tell you one thing. The number of elements that I used here is probably the most that you'd ever want to use. And that's a good thing, because the game took about 2 hours to play, and if this is about as big as you really need, well, guess what? If you wanted to, I could probably combine 2 of these playing areas together and double the size of my game and still end up with a game that could potentially finish within a day. And that gives me basically 2 cores against 2 cores. And that's something that is very unusual in the figure gaming world. This ends my example play of the rules. From this point on, I'll be covering some observations I made while using these rules, both related to the game system, but more focused on the terrain and basing. Because I lacked space and wanted to keep my game set up for a few days, I used a table in my garage, which meant both players were on the same side of the playing area because the table is rammed up against the wall. I need some room for my poor old Audi. I originally thought this was going to be an issue, but because of the nature of the rule or game system, it ended up not being an issue. When the Russian player had to move, I normally felt like walking away, getting a drink, or just resting. As long as you trust your opponent, this was actually a welcome reprieve. Originally, I considered this as a sign of a bad game system, as during movement only one player was doing anything and the other was bored. However, for figure gaming, I found this rather useful as it allowed gameplay to continue while one player, went for a drink or visited the toilet or simply rested. My next observation was just how much of the playing area ended up being unused, apart from manoeuvring purposes. Now, I have to admit, room for manoeuvring was important, but it does make me think I could create scenarios on smaller playing areas. I currently have playing areas which fit perfectly on a single folding table, which means they're 70 centimetres deep. For example, this one is 90 centimetres deep and does not fit on a single table unless you have two folding tables or you have some sort of base underneath which the playing area can be placed on, which happens to be 90 centimetres deep. Now, the advantages of a 70 centimetre deep playing area is both players can remain seated for the entire game. I always considered this as a big plus because one of the biggest issues I had was basically being exhausted during a game. On the other hand, this game took only 2 hours to play. I must admit we went through the game turns, or the 8 game turns, rather quickly, and the last game turn we sort of just skipped through because we knew the Germans had lost. But nonetheless, I never had a figure game which lasted such a short time and actually had an end, and we got to the end. Now, I must admit, both players, myself and my opponent, did take safe options. I suppose with more thought you could do better and take longer as a result, but I suspect you could easily have 2 games in a day, even if you were serious at gaming. With such a short gameplay, and with one player being seated while the other moved his units while standing, I did not end a game as fatigued as I normally do. I also noticed this with my Napoleonics games, that is the ones that were based on the SPI Napoleonic board game quads. But after 6 games of that, I found pretty much all of them were quite quick, and I was not exhausted in any of them. And I used a 3x4 playing area, which meant I had to stand when I moved. So maybe the issue with fatigue is simply to do with the actual game system and rules. Each game takes too long to play and just involves you to, or requires you to stand all the time, something that is not an issue with these game systems. My next observation goes into basing. I must admit, having changed my mind about basing a lot, and if you look at my earlier videos, you'll see how bad my earlier basing system was. I moved to this style, which you can see here. I moved to the style which you saw in the previous images, which I generally was happy with my micro armour. My issue was that when I started rebasing my Napoleonics, I started using a 2-tone flocking system using fine turf from woodlands, which I consider as much nicer and which you can see here. The other aspect which I liked was how it matched the playing area. These days all my playing areas, even my cork tiles, use 2-tone woodland fine turf. When the base uses the same system, they turn to merge in with the playing area very nicely and almost become invisible. This is especially the case if the edges of the base are black. Looks like I may be rebasing my micro armour yet again, I think probably for the 4th time. As a general rule, I rarely deploy trucks or even field artillery on the playing area, even when using rules such as LWRS, which is a ground scale of 1 in 10,000. As a result, I never bothered to put much effort into basing these figures. At the scale of Neu-Schwerpunkt, this changed dramatically. I need a lot of artillery on the playing area. Luckily for me, I went through a phase when I purchased a lot of artillery, which I almost never then used, and as a result I stopped purchasing it. Now I can actually use it, and I'll rebase those figures using a woodland fine turf and some woodland brush on it to make them look a lot better. One issue I had while playing this game was differentiating between horse-towed and truck-towed artillery. I suspect I may put more effort on making my artillery elements more like diorama and include a horse for horse-towed and a truck for truck-towed. Even before I started moving down this kind of game system idea, I was thinking of making my artillery more diorama-like. But as I never deploy them on the playing area, it was always a very low priority. I will rethink this and give my artillery a bit more bling, as well as differentiating them from truck and horse-towed. What you see here is a bunch of GHQ artillery, and I've noticed GHQ has a special where I can get 15% off or something of that nature. So I think I may lash out and pick up some artillery with trucks and crew and stuff like that, so I can put together some nice diorama. I particularly like the Russian infantry gun being towed by that little carrier with the guy sitting on the back. Looks quite interesting. One issue I've been rethinking is base thickness. I originally went for 3mm bases, as these were easier to handle. My earlier bases were 2mm, and I had a real trouble handling artillery and infantry in some of the smaller vehicles. The 3mm bases would pretty much resolve this. On the other hand, I've been rebasing all my Napoleonic figures, and they're all on 2mm bases, and I didn't really have the issues there, mainly because the figure is large, but I do like the thinner base in some areas. After this game, I am convinced the thicker bases are better for moving units around. This was a very dynamic game, much more than a typical figure game where it's possible for elements to stay in one place for most of the game, or at least not moving very much. The thick bases made moving them very easy. The only issues are the edges, which you can see are a motley brown colour. With my Napoleonic bases, I am now making the edges black so they become invisible, and I will do the same with these bases, as it also hides the white line at the bottom, which is my figure label. Incidentally, all my bases have labels underneath which tell me what the figure is. The reason why I do this is because after almost 20 years of my figures being in boxes, when I brought them out, I couldn't recognise what half the figures were. So I've now decided to actually put a label underneath the base telling me exactly what they are, so I don't mix up a Wesp with a Marder. I also label the rear edges, but I'm uncertain if I'll continue to do this. With rules such as these, there's no need to know if your Panzer IV is an Ausche or Aushech. If I change my mind, I can always come back and label the rears, but I think I'll probably avoid that with my rebasing. While I definitely intend on creating bases which tend to merge in and match with the playing area, one thought I have is giving each side a slightly different base colour or scheme. While the Germans and Russians do have a very slight difference, it's basically not noticeable. With rules such as this, having a clearer difference in bases will make seeing the front line easier. With squad scale rules, it's not an issue, as elements never really get close to each other. But here they do, and it would be nice for me to be able to quickly identify the Russian front line and the German front line, which quite frankly here is not easy to do. I adopted the Woodlands brush-covered woods terrain figures a while ago, and they work very well. However, I have clarified my size requirement over the last couple of years. The square pieces, as shown here, are my old woods for micro armour, and I found them not as useful as smaller square or rectangular woods pieces. They also don't really look as good or as realistic. The rectangular woods idea comes from my Napoleonic's area terrain, and the rectangular pieces that you see on this playing area, or at least earlier in this video, are my Napoleonic's woods area terrain pieces. Now, in that particular case, I adopted the concept of the basic size of area terrain being a base width plus 2 centimetre square size. So for Napoleonics, each area terrain piece is a 6 centimetre square, or a rectangle which is 6 centimetres wide and 12 centimetres long. I've found generally this is all I need and rarely use any other sizes. I'm in process of updating my micro armour area terrain using the same size formula, although in that case the area terrain will be 5 cm square or 5 cm wide by 10 cm deep. Now it's not a big difference, but I might as well get the area terrain to match my bases. Now the reason why I've adopted this kind of formula is the edges of the area terrain. I find my trusty electric drill with a grinding bit does a good job edging my area terrain pieces, giving it a nice slope effect. The hill, which you can see here, which in these rules represents rough terrain, is an old hill with a minimal rounded edge. In those days I used a battery powered drill and it was much harder to smooth it out. These days I make the slope about 1 cm deep, or at least 1 cm wide, and that looks really good. Of course, an element on a hill will overhang if the hill is an element wide, so the area terrain is 2 cm larger all around, allowing an element to fit nice and neatly on top of it without any overhanging. With woods this is not necessary, but I prefer to make all area terrain the same size. The only exception to this are built up areas, which are all 1 element square, as you can see here, and these can be joined together and allow elements to fit on top of them nice and neatly. For rivers, unfortunately, I really have no solution, and I've tried a lot of ideas. The best rivers are embedded in the playing area and covered with glossy wood polish. However, rivers embedded in a playing area dramatically reduces the flexibility of that playing area. Perhaps one day I'll work something out, but for now I use blue felt, or I use my 2 custom playing areas and just wear the fact that I can't move the rivers around. Roads are my other problem, and I really have no real good solution which I think is perfect. Embedded roads look the best, but that limits the flexibility of your playing area. My current solution is to use a simple and standard road network in my standard playing areas, and when I need more roads I simply use brown felt strips. One thought I've had is to create a universal playing area and create a wide range of different scenarios for it. I've created a Napoleonic Leipzig playing area and a Cold War Würzburg playing area. Perhaps I can just keep on using the same basic playing areas which contain embedded rivers and roads and just create a wide range of scenarios for it. This may be a bit boring, but could be more than adequate, and I end up with a playing area which I consider particularly good looking. I find after each game I get a host of new ideas, and the last few games using this board game inspired rule system is no exception. However, any thoughts I provide here are just that, thoughts, and I've changed my mind so many times about different aspects of gaming. No one should take any of these ideas as some form of final, correct end state. Results may vary, basically. So we come to the end of my Part 1 examples of play for Neu-Schwerpunkt Version 1 rules. The rules can be downloaded from the IO group Schwerpunkt site. My current conclusion is the rules work. They give you a good game in a short time period with a clear end result, and allows you to use all those figures which you sweated blood and tears painting and which you previously never really used very much. One thing that I really noticed was how I can actually use all my trucks, bicycle troops and other odd types of troops I never used in a game previously. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heimatland zu kämpfen.